tuning in from. My name is Sedda Antekelian. I'm the Education and Outreach Specialist at USC Shoah Foundation, as well as a volunteer of the Ararat-Eskijian Museum. I, along with my colleagues, are very excited to begin today's presentation of Missak Khralian's Palahovid, an ancestral memoir, brought to you by the collaboration between the Ararat-Eskijian Museum, the Armenian Film Foundation, and the Gomidas Institute. We can go ahead and begin the quick slide. Pull up the slide, if you don't mind, Ani. Today, we will be focused on going into the detail into the memoir of Missak Khralian, who, as a survivor of the Armenian genocide, documented the destruction and abuse he witnessed occur to the people of his ancestral village of Til Palu. His memoir captures the enduring terror of survivors even decades after 1915. In today's presentation, historian Ara Sarafian will discuss the Armenian genocide in the Palu region and the significance of this memoir as a milestone in the historiography of the Armenian genocide and its aftermath. Following his presentation will be a discussion between himself and Dr. Carla Garabedian, and we will conclude with an audience Q&A. As the presentation is going on, please feel free to drop in your questions into the Q&A. But to begin, I would like to invite Ararat-Eskijian Museum's longtime director, Ms. Mangasarian Goshen, to tell us more about the origins of this project. Maggie?
Thank you. Thank you, Sedda. Thank you for all your assistance for putting together today's event. And I also want to thank Ani, our executive secretary, who's working behind the scenes. I'm speechless. I've been waiting for today for almost 3 years. I'm sorry, I'm speechless because I'm getting emotional. I'm so sorry. I want to say thank you to Dr. Carla Garabedian for accepting our invitation. And she's been a pillar of support of Armenian Ararat-Eskijian Museum events, as well through the Armenian Film Foundation. And we're happy that they're collaborating with us at today's event. And I'm looking for today's discussion. As to Ara, I am speechless, Ara. I've known about your work. I'm very excited that 3 years ago, we took a trip to Palu, organized by both organizations, the Gomidas and as well as the Armenian Film Foundation. And Ara had the initiative to ask me, right as we were standing on the bridge in Palu, if the Ararat-Eskijian Museum would be interested to sponsor the translation of the book. I had never heard about Khralian. I don't know much about Palu, because my father is a Palutsi. I'm the daughter of Palutsi. And I grew up with Palutsis in Lebanon. However, we don't know anything about my father's past. My father had completely erased from his memory about his childhood. He was 11 years old when he left Palu and ended up in Istanbul, eventually in Lebanon. For me, reading Khralian's book was very important to publish it through Ara's efforts. That is because I will get a glimpse of what my father's life would have been if he had shared with us. So Missak Khralian's book is not about Missak's memoir, but it's the memoir of all the young children that perished in the 1915 genocide in Palu, because my father is one of them. So for me, it brings me closure about my father to what kind of life he had lived or he had seen. That's why he had completely erased from his mind. In Lebanon, my father only associated with Palutsis. We could only shop from them. All his patriotic, he used to call them Hayrenagids, compatriot. We had to buy our shoes from a Palutsi. We had to buy our clothes from a Palutsi. We had to get the mixed nuts on Sundays from a Palutsi because he wanted that closure. Because he had no relatives except one sister. So knowing all of this, I am eternally grateful to Ara. This book is not only about Missak. This book should be taught in many schools as well, because it truly gives a glimpse of the atrocities those children went through. So he becomes their voice. Thank you very much. And back to you, Sedda.
And now I'd like to introduce Ara Sarafian. Ara Sarafian is a British Armenian archival historian specializing in late Ottoman and modern Armenian history. He is also the executive director of the Gomidas Institute. His publications include a critical edition of the British Parliamentary Blue Book on the Armenian Genocide, the treatment of Armenians in the Ottoman Empire between 1915 and 1916, originally published in 1916 by British historians Lord James Bryce and Arnold Toynbee. And Talat Pasha, a report on the Armenian genocide. His work has also been the subject of 2 documentary films, including Gagik Karagosian's The Blue Book, Political Truth or Historical Fact in 2009, and John Lubach's 100 Years Later in 2015, focused on his work with Kurdish civil society organizations in Turkey around the 100th anniversary of the Armenian genocide. I would now like to invite Ara to tell us more about the history and story behind this special memoir. Ara?
Thank you. Can you see me, yes? Okay. I would also like to start by thanking Maggie for the support for this project, but most importantly, the Caribbean, Mr. Thierry Caribbean and Missak Khralian's family who agreed to allow us to translate this work. When I first read the Missak Khralian's account, I was sort of stupefied, and I didn't know what to make of it, because it's one of the most shocking books that I've read, and I had many question marks about it, and it took me a while to try and sort those out. And because when we're dealing with genocide documentation, now we should be critical of our own materials. Now, why does this memoir merit this type of attention, serious attention? What is it that makes it special? One of the most paradoxical aspects of this work is the fact that it's written by an articulate person, but in many ways it's a choppy account. It's not a polished. It's not a. It still has retained its raw authenticity in terms of style and content, and if from that perspective, it really is the words of the author himself that you feel that you have contact with. When I was making a mind map of the work, I said, the starting point of this book is that right at the end. It's the pain, it's the anguish, it's the suffering of a genocide survivor in 1930s who comes to the realization that they really have lost their ancestral line. They have lost their homeland, that the world doesn't care. There's a sense of injustice that even the young generation seems to be indifferent. And there's a painful element that goes throughout the book. And of course, it is about the genocide. So it really imparts a very specific type of meaning to the genocide, and of course, what does it mean to be a genocide survivor? And one can see this type of commentary, many genocide survivors from 1930s and 40s who spoke in the same vein, this sense of, injustice, pain and injustice that they had to endure. And I think in many ways, Maggie probably alluded to that early when she spoke of her own father. So when I was on Palu Bridge, our minds came together, and I made a suggestion. So if I can show share my screen. This is Missak Khralian, probably 1930s in France, where he lived with his family. And this is his book. It's a very unassuming book, printed in 1938 in Sofia, in Armenian. I stumbled across my copy at the Samuelian bookshop in Paris, which unfortunately has closed. And there are many such Armenian publications that collect dust, are relatively or perhaps even wholly unknown, that we really should pay more attention to. I'm glad that I saw it, I bought it, and I read it, and that was my focus for Palu. For those who don't know, excuse me, where Palu is, I've sort of put it on a map here. You can see a little red dot. That's where Palu is. This is where the book is focused on. If I may show you my cursor, this is the Kharpet area, better known to its west, Erzurum and Köri to the north, Bitlis to the east, and Diyarbakir to the west. So it's bang in the center of historic Armenia. And what it went through in 1915, in terms of genocide, of course, was typical of the eastern provinces, where the destruction was, I would say, complete, particularly brutal, and most of the massacres took place locally, not, in the deserts of Syria. Regarding Palu area, Armenians made up around a third of the population of the province as a whole, make it smaller, but they were concentrated in the alluvial plains where they were in a larger proportion. So on this map are a distribution of Armenian villages only. We're not counting with purely villages that don't have any Armenian in them, but it gives you a sense of how spread apart they were, and somehow the ethnic composition. They were predominantly Armenian, including the village of Til, right down here at the bottom in the center. About a third to a quarter to a third of the village was Turkish and Kurdish, mainly Kurdish. It was agricultural settlement where the Khralian families settled in the 19th century. This is from a 1913 Armenian census by the Patriarchate, and it gives which recorded about 12,000 Armenians in the province as a whole. So it's a very small population, was a very small province or Kaza of the Ottoman Empire where the Armenians are concerned. Now here we have the same map, but when we talk of the Armenian genocide in Palu, we can say that all of those red dots where the Armenians resided were subjected to genocidal policy, and they were destroyed. But Palu also had a distinction, unfortunate distinction, that it was along deportation routes, and that's what the arrows are. So many of the Kretsis further north were brought down through Palu, and they were murdered in the Palu region. In fact, the famous Palu Bridge was one of the main massacre sites. It's a nodal point that they converged on. And we have many accounts of the killings that took place. So the very spot on which Maggie and I first spoke about her family, her father's experience. Her father was lucky to have been taken off the bridge and survived, whereas literally thousands didn't. They died there. And then some of those deportees who weren't killed on the bridge continued on the south of the river. That's the eastern Euphrates, or the Ararat-Eskijian in Armenian. They continued along those routes. They walked past Til. So Khralian would have been cognizant. He was cognizant of the passing caravans, and he does mention them. But most of Khralian's actual memoir is what happened in the village of Til itself. Now, before we go to what his account of the genocide, the obvious question that a historian, or I would say a good historian, should ask is, how do we know what Khralian says about Til to be credible? I myself would like to know that too. How much can we ascribe to his word at first sight? So for that purpose, I've identified four other sources from the same region, and four of them were written by boys like Missak Khralian, who lived through this period. The closest two would be Hampartum Chichian, his memoir, further north in Peri, in many ways mirrors what happened to Missak in Til. Then Melkon Derderian is an interesting character because he started his life in the village of Hoshe near Peri, but in 1915, he moved within less than a mile from Til itself. And all of these accounts talk of the Armenian genocide, not only in terms of the murder of people and deportation, mainly men, but deportation and the murder, abuse of women and kids, but they also talk about a very large number of young Armenian women and children who were held captive, who were held behind, and who were held for what I would say is assimilation into Muslim households as Turks and Kurds. All of them were required to change their names. All of them were required to renounce their Christian faith. All of them were farmed out. So if you're two brothers, in the case of both Khralian, but also Chichian, you were separated. You were not kept together, farmed out into other families where you were supposed to assimilate and become, I guess, Turkish or Kurdish. Already at this point, these are all boys writing their memoirs, because there were women survivors too, but their faith was in some ways worse. They were restricted to the private sphere. They were kept indoors. They did not have the freedom to move. They did not have the freedom to liaise with other Armenian children, and or to escape, for that matter. And we have, I do not, and when I talk about Khralian's memoir, one of his most important contribution is that he talks about what happened. Maggie, I feel like you do. He gives very graphic accounts of the women, his relatives in the village. Now, because Til was a relatively small village, it had a population of about 160 Armenians, about 10 Kurds, and about 60 Kurds and 10 Turks. The Kurdish family was actually the family of a beg, a landlord who owned 8 or 9 other villages. He was a powerful man. And in this village, Khralian, the victim, and the victimizers knew each other. They knew each other from before 1915. They knew by name, by character, by family. So when Khralian starts narrating what happened to him, there's this familiar aspect to it. And the quality of the work is such that the innocent language is written in is that Missak does not realize what was happening. Even in 1930s, when he was writing his memoirs, he was mentioning things that today we make sense, better sense. But when he was recording certain elements, and this is part of the raw authenticity of the primary source, he didn't realize the significance. It was a bizarre things happen. So as he started narrating the village, what we call vilification, suddenly he talks about Armenians, rumors about Armenians, that there were rumors that Armenians were, this is World War I, right? Armenians were liaising with the government, that there were with the Russians. They had literally physical links to the Russians, underground, sending messages to them. That the Khralian family had secret weapons that fired like bombs that released gases. Now he records these sort of elements in his memoir without, simply because it happened in bizarre events, and it leaves it at that. He doesn't realize what he's actually describing is a vilification process. People don't just make up rumors like that. Rumors are made up because of what's coming next. Similarly, alluding to the raw quality, the whole genocide process starts with him describing how one day, from the village of Til, they started watching the next village, Turkhe, being surrounded by this rabble of government officials, government troops, irregular forces, and local Kurds who obliterate the village, ransack it, and next thing you know, they come to their own village. He doesn't put the dots together thinking, well, this was part of a systematic process. He doesn't think it through, and that's what makes his work fascinating. And the whole process starts with, and of course, the same rabble can come to, this is June 1915, and the village of Til becomes victimized. In the same way, it's completely covered by external forces, and the Armenian men are taken away to stables, including his father, who are completely stupefied. They don't know what's going on. And that's how he writes about it. He's describing, without actually putting in the genocide context, he's just saying, this is amazing. They all sent into the barn. And those Armenians who actually managed to escape were either captured or shot trying to escape, including his own uncle. And so he describes in a very naive way what was going on. And of course, but a few weeks later, after being kept in the barn and the escapees being captured, he gives one a very moving account of his last meeting with his dad. The father is speechless. He sort of realized what's going on. But this is a more typical response of Armenians. They did not expect this to happen. These things happen one after the other. And Khralian captures these essential moments in what happened to Armenia at the time. The men are just simply taken away and killed outright. And how do we know that? Is because a week or so later, the boys, Kurdish boys in the village, tell him, "Oh, your father is on the Euphrates, his bloated body," and he goes and sees his father, and he describes the moment where he's examining his bloated body. I think he's wearing an underwear. That's it. He can see he's shot, and he doesn't know what to do. He's a 13-year-old boy, and could be 12, could be 14. He's a 13-year-old boy who's confronted with this reality, and he's describing that moment, and he just pushes it out back into the river, presuming it was rotting by then. And the memoir is full of these little small sketches. And in subsequent period, of course, he because it's a small village, he's taken up first by one Kurdish family, and then he's taken away by Hashim Bey, the beg, the actual lord of the village itself. And that gives him an vantage point of what was going on. When he describes who was responsible for this, it is when he says local officials came, gendarmes came, they organized this caravan to go, that caravan to go. He really was in an advantageous position to observe what was going on. He had to convert to of course, Islam. He had to assume a Muslim name, and he became a cowherd. And this is another paradox of the Armenian genocide, because it happened elsewhere. Having killed the majority Armenians of the village and taken over their properties, I guess they had a problem. How do you look after all these animals? So suddenly these cowherds appear, Armenian boys who become cowherds, yet already at that age, they are getting their flocks, their cows, and they're trying to network with each other to figure out what's going on. And a lot of Khralian's memoir is about information that he's gathering. He's aware of what's going on in the household of Hashim Bey. He's talking with the other boys in the village, and he's observing many of the women victims in different households. And one of his roles in Hashim Bey's service was to be a messenger. And Khralian it's absolutely remarkable that he has access to the harem. Harem meaning the women's quarter of Hashim Bey, where there were young Armenian women also held. And a good chunk of the memoir is about the fate of these women. And you realize what Khralian is describing in terms of what happens to them is that these girls were being groomed to volunteer or to accept, to submit themselves to become wives to Kurdish or Muslim men. There's an attempt to convince them, that life is over as they know it. They have to convert, they are given new names, and they will become the wives of, deserving Kurdish or Turkish men. And he described specific women, specific girls, I should say, because they're 13, 14, 15 years old. One of them is, I think, Shogat, a mother and daughter who had trekked over from Trabzon. In fact, there is another girl, sister, who was abducted at Palu Bridge just before Til. And the description is the harrowing encounter of her refusing to convert and to become, to accept her fate, and their conversations, how very boyish, childish conversations. And of course, in the end, of course, we know what happened to Shogat because she didn't come. One day she disappears and ends up, I guess it's a brothel, ends up in a beg's brothel, as they say, handed around the begs. And Missak knows about this because one day he's asked to go, he thought he was going to be killed, by the way. He was asked to go in the middle of the night to this other beg's konak, mansion, where he was required to bury her fetus of either an unborn child or an aborted child, or a child that died, and where he sees Shogat again. I mean, it's a disgusting, very sad. She's emaciated, she's dying, and in the end, she's sent back to Til, where she dies, and he buries her. I mean, this is a very intimate account, and this is a more typical, at least a typology of what happened to a lot of young women, but which we don't hear. There's another girl, Satenik. Satenik is from Til itself. He knows her. And the women in the harem say, why don't you marry her? Why don't you marry her? You go save her. Now that you're Muslim, you can. And he says, I can't. I'm living in rags. I'm living in a barn. And he doesn't marry her. And in the end, Satenik is taken away to a Muslim man in the village. He makes eye contact with her from outside, but of course she's confined in this rather unpleasant man's house. And one day disappears, and he thinks that she was murdered, but she disappears. There's no protection for these people. And then there's another time he describes how while taking the flock out, he describes coming across a corpse, and he realizes it's the corpse of his aunt, who was taken away out of the village. Marriage occurred, and she was probably trying to escape back, and she had been caught, had her throat cut, and left there. I mean, this is a very intimate account, very local history account of the Armenian genocide that he's recording for posterity. And these are people that he knows, and he has other relatives who be married off, some who remain there. Now, so this is a type of narrative it is. It's written in a raw format, which is really makes it immediate because it's not polished. That makes it incredibly powerful. And if you read the book carefully, you realize that his stories between 1915, the genocide from 1915 till 1922, when he fled. But in actual fact, the bulk of what he's describing is between 1915 and 16, because at the end of 1916, Missak escapes after seeing all this, and he escapes to Kharpet, where he's adopted by a kind Turkish family that takes good care of him. And Missak survives the rest of the genocide period in Kharpet. He acknowledges this, but doesn't give the same amount of space as what was happening in Til. In 1920 comes another predicament. The Ottomans have lost the war, and Missak decides that he wants to go back to Til to see what remains of his family. And incredibly, he goes back and he makes peace with Hashim Beg, who had beaten him nearly to death before he had escaped. And effectively, he says, I forego my wealth, family wealth, just give us what remains of our mill. And he becomes a miller in the village of Til. So I suspect many Armenians tried to go back and live. What else were they supposed to do? And he finds a cousin, Juhar, another male cousin, his stepmother, and another aunt. So again, it's a very different type of narrative, and it's probably not as unusual as we may think it is. But he doesn't even survive a year because he has falling as right word, Hashim Beg, and this is his story. He said that Hashim Beg wanted to, what I would say, rape his niece, Juhar, who must have been 15 or 16. And they were not compliant in that process. And because of that, he gets beaten again, his ribs broken, and thrown out of the village. And they're all thrown out of the village. And he goes back to Kharpet, where they were by the 1920-21, there were Armenian orphanages. He goes to the Armenian orphanage, not the American one that we know more about, but there was an Armenian prelacy there. So this is between the fall of the Ottoman Empire and the rise of Kemalist Turkey. Armenians tried to go back. The prelacy started its work again. They started collecting these remnants of Armenians back. And he takes some of these relatives back. And then in the end, Missak escapes, or he's evacuated to Aleppo and then Beirut. So Maggie, your father may very well have known this man, and where he goes to orphanage and eventually ends up in France. So this is an important memoir because it has a hallmarks of an authentic account, because much of what he says can be corroborated by the experiences of other genocide survivors in the region, including one particular man, Sarkis Bogosian, who was an Ottoman officer in the Ottoman army. He was a supply officer who went through this region in 1916. And he also describes what he sees in these former Armenian villages. And he also describes many Armenian children, all right, many Armenian girls, and some which he suspects to be Armenians, others who he knows to be Armenian, who were left behind. A good number of these children were collected by missionaries and Armenians at the end of World War I, but I think the majority of them never made it out. Majority of them remained behind in these villages. So in Missak's case, because he left, and he may never have left, if Hashim Beg had left him alone, he may very well have stayed in Til, and he may have been one of the so-called secret Armenians in Turkey itself. We don't know how many people of Armenian origin there are in that region. I don't know, they might be Muslim, they might be crypto-Christian, but I suspect there's a rather large number. And this memoir intersects the beginnings of these communities that stayed behind and as crypto-Armenians, or the beginning of Palutis who survived, children, and who escaped. So what Khralian's memoir does is it accounts for those who survived and either escaped or who survived and remained behind. It also gives us a better account, a better understanding, and in the graphic understanding of the experience of women who have almost no voice. I do not know of any Armenian woman, a young woman or older survivor woman who went into harem, who was married to a Muslim and who escaped or who didn't escape and ended up giving a frank account of that whole process of grooming and assimilation. And I suspect there were thousands of such cases, and Khralian gives us insight into that world. So it is an important memoir, and it makes us appreciate that the Armenian genocide was not simply about massacring the men and just deporting the women. There was a much cruder elements to it, where the state oversaw a process of enforced assimilation. And since I just remembered another point, those who did not assimilate, including the mothers of these young women, because they often kept the mothers with the young women. In August 1915, there was a census taken in the village. In fact, Missak was asked to prepare it because the other Kurdish and Turkish population, including gendarmes, were illiterate. They couldn't read and write. And the purpose of the census was to determine how many of the remaining Armenians had married off, as it were, and assimilated or assimilated children. And those who hadn't were deported one more time. And so by August, and you can see that there's a state's involvement in overseeing the whole assimilation process in a systematic manner. Let me show a couple of more quick graphics of what we're talking about. This is a village of Til. The area I'm showing that's marked in red is the area in which Missak lived. So Missak knew what went on in that area, including at the bottom by the river where deportation caravans passed, where, as he put it, all summer there was unbearable stench, meaning but he doesn't go into detail, but obviously of people who've been killed. And this was his will. And this is how detailed it is in terms of the physical, geographical scope of what happened in Til. And this is my graphic analysis. If you read Khralian's account very, very carefully, this is what happened to 160 Armenians of the village. All right. So the first batch that were murdered in June are the men arrested and killed outright. All right. Already most of the men are in that category. Then you had the deportation and disappearance of women and children, a large number, including his family members and some of his family, distant relatives. There is a graphic description. They knew what was going to happen to them. They expected to die. There is a terrible, terrible 2 pages where he describes how one of his distant relatives who had 3 children, one of which was, I think, 3-year-old boy, asked Khralian, and this is a confession of Khralian's part, to drown that child, because the mother knew that if they set up on those deportations with 3 children, including one they had to carry, they would all die. And he gives a very disturbing account of how he himself helped her drown that child. It's a confession. He was obviously tortured. Again, the raw quality of the manuscript. He's tortured by the memory of what he had to do to survive. Infanticide was part of it. It was much more common. You realize when you look at what happened, what's going on in Palo region. You look at elsewhere. Some parents threw their kids into the river, and some jumping with them, some not jumping with them. Infanticide was forced on them. Certainly in this case, again, very powerful section, very rare account, very rare confession. So by end of June, over half the population was deported outright, as in the case of men or women and kids who were sent off and killed or reportedly killed in the Mastar Mountains. He doesn't go into details how he knew where this information came from, but I suspect it was pretty clear cut, including gendarmes. the gendarmes, when they passed by the village of Til, they stayed with Hashim Beg, his lords, right? The man he served in his palace, his mansion, as they call it. And he describes how they used to discuss what they were doing to Armenians. So he was listening to their stories as well. Then we have a number of children, of course, deported with the women and killed. Then you have the August 1915 deportation of 13 to 35-year-olds. That means those women who were not assimilated, who did not submit to assimilation, or perhaps they were not wanted, they were also sent off and disappeared. Then there's a question of women aged 35 who were killed in captivity. So there is abuse. This is the nature of assimilation process. If you don't do what you're told, you could be killed, like I guess his aunts, Ochida, who ran away, and probably Satanig as well. She was also killed, concrete cases. And child murder. Some children were taken in by Muslim families, as he describes, only to find out where those children's parents had hidden gold or their wealth. And many of those kids were subsequently killed. This is from the memoir. And then we have accounted for, some kids were unaccounted for, up to the age of 13, forced marriages, small number. And then, of course, assimilated kids. That's a quite large number. Probably we're talking about 10, 15 children in a village of 155 Armenians. It sort of makes sense because Missak had his younger brother also placed with a Kurdish family. In fact, Missak says one of his to his relief that his brother Setrak, younger brother, was placed with a kind Kurdish family. He says, and it's the only kind Kurdish family, because all the others partook in the loot and the abuse of people, and even in the murder that took place. So again, a face-to-face localized account of the Armenian genocide where victim and victimizer knew each other. And Missak memoir gives us such an account, insightful account, that should be part of the dominant historiography of the Armenian genocide. I'll stop there. There's a lot we can say. I suspect that Carla will have a few questions, and as well as our listeners. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ara, for contextualizing this history, the history behind the memoir, and highlighting the significant narratives of the events that Khralian witnessed and heard during and after the Armenian genocide. And we're very grateful to you and your work. And I'm sure we can all relate to how emotionally painful it can be to read and hear accounts such as Khralian's, but yet also recognize the importance of the responsibility that comes with sharing his story. I'd now like to invite Dr. Garabedian on to lead a conversational discussion with Ara on more about the key themes and stories within the memoir. And so now, just to give you a quick introduction, Dr. Garabedian is an award-winning documentary filmmaker and board member of the Armenian Film Foundation. Through her life's work, she continues to spread awareness of current and historical issues around the world. She was the first American to anchor BBC World News and was the London correspondent for CNBC and an occasional reporter for NBC News. She is well known for her award-winning film Screamers, released in 2006, and which was screened in the US Congress, British Parliament, Canadian Parliament, European Parliament, as well as the United Nations and many universities. The film has actually been translated into 12 languages. She also has worked on the documentation of the Armenian Film Foundation's collection of Armenian genocide survivor audiovisual testimony, which are now digitized and available to view in USC Shoah Foundation's Visual History Archive. Additionally, Dr. Garabedian has played notable roles in the production of many films, including serving as the associate producer and historical consultant of The Promise. Currently, she is making Nemesis 1921, a movie about a trial in Berlin, which revealed Germany's complicity in the Armenian genocide. And so with that, I invite you on, Carla.
Thank you very much, Sedda, and thank you, Ara, for that very comprehensive description of the book. And I'm going to actually show folks. And I have to say, you know, I was dipping into it over the last week, and because it's a short book and it's easy to read, but its content is so disturbing that it's like I could only take so much of it in one dose. And this morning when I went through it again, I think I got the global picture, and I was very grateful for you, Ara, sort of putting into context that, you know, the peaks and troughs of his experience. For me, what I came away with was an unusual account of the communal nature of the genocide in this particular area, the way it worked in detail. And, you know, what I mean by that is that, you know, you knew who was attacking you. And in fact, many of these Armenians had been targeted for years. So you got a sense also of the Hamidian massacres and how the sort of aftermath, the memory of that period was very much in the village. So knowing who's targeting you, being a victim of who's targeting you, that's one thing, the very communal nature, which reminds me of the Rwandan genocide. I've never made that connection before in quite this way, but in the Rwandan genocide, people were not able to escape their neighbors. And this is what happened to Khralian. So that's what struck me. The sexual violence that is really very detailed, but also the grooming nature of the girls, as you pointed out, how that worked over time as well. So it's not like things are just happening once and then it's over with. This is happening over years in his account. So he might see somebody and then maybe catch up with them later. And so he's got sort of a timeline of what happened to these people. It's not just a short account, it spans time. So for me, I wanted to ask you about a couple things, Ara. One, in that period that he was with the Turkish family who was kind to him between 1917 and 1920, what was happening in that region politically? Well, I mean, we're basically talking about the end of the First World War, the Kemalist period, but in that particular area where Till was, what was happening?
Well, actually, Carla, he joined the family in 1916, end of 16. So the war was still at war. So he was extremely lucky to have been picked up by a Turkish family who took extremely good care of him, who taught him how to read and write. So he learned how to read and write Turkish. So he would read novels to the mother. Apparently the family had lost a child of their own. So he was like a substitute child. And when you read but by 1920, when the war comes to an end, the Ottomans capitulate, it's also moving how the family simply allowed him to go. They said, we're not going to stop you. I mean, this is the antithesis of genocide. They protected him in a sense when he kept his identity, and they let him go with tears in their eyes. And I found that extremely moving. I wish I could find the descendants. Maybe we'll be able to do that one day. It's entirely possible. But this was a gray area. So having lost the war, you had two governments. You had Kemalist Mustafa Kemal Atatürk in a Sivas Congress and around Ankara area, but with contacts in the Harput region. But they were not dominant yet. But they were getting more and more powerful. So during that vacuum, the official government in Constantinople allowed American missionaries to come back in 1919, but also the Armenian Church. We know more about the American missionaries because we have the sources available. They have got their own archives. But there was an Armenian prelacy. There was an Armenian prelate, and they had orphanages in I'm not sure it's Harput itself, but in Elazığ, which is down the road. And I have one account of how that was run. And there too, they were gathering Armenian kids, they were gathering women. In fact, they were saying that the American missionaries were afraid of taking in young girls because many of these men would come and try and reclaim their properties. Mm-hmm. And so they would go to the Armenian prelacy, and the prelate, I forgot his name now, played a very careful diplomacy in between the Kemalists and the official government in Istanbul, Constantinople. And he's a person who negotiated so that as the Kemalists power expanded into this area, he negotiated for literally thousands of these children to leave. And remember, Khralian would have been about 20 years old this time. That's military conscription age. There was a threat of conscripting these Armenian kids into the Kemalist army. All right, imagine the irony of it. So there was all politics going on. It hasn't really been studied closely, but there's enough material to see that there's something there. But we know little about that. But there were certainly hundreds, but possibly thousands of other orphans who were then sent to Constantinople orphanage, and then probably to Greece or Egypt, or of course to Aleppo. They were in a huge caravan, and Khralian was on the last caravan, so he was a problematic category. So it was during that time that there was hope that, well, maybe Armenians can now reestablish themselves. The genocides come, they lost the war. Well, we're not going anywhere. We want to stay. He wanted to stay. That's why he went back to Til. And it's under Kemalist Turkey that they had to leave. Now, to be fair, I'm not sure the Kemalists, well, actually, that's not entirely true. The Kemalists did chase these Armenians out in 1920s. Those who remain in large number were kicked out of the area. Presumably those who had assimilated or who had hidden their identity as Turks and Muslims or whatever, and who were probably useful for the local Aras, local Turks, they actually stayed behind. So Armenians were still being chased out of this region until the late 1920s.
He does have an account in the book about Henry Riggs and going to I don't know if it would be called an orphanage, but where Henry Riggs was passing out aid, and the frustration of Armenians not being able to get aid. What was your impression about his take on Henry Riggs?
You know what? There are other accounts where Armenian survivors are very, very critical of the American missionaries. But I've also worked on missionary sources like Jacobson's diaries, which is very insightful in Riggs' own account. The real problem was that they didn't have enough to give to everybody. They had to make these terrible choices. And of course, he mocks them. He says, yeah, we don't want your prayers. We want food. And he mocks certain Armenians who work for him, saying they're all nicely doled up, accusation that they were profiting from the sale of food. I don't think it's substantiated, but that's part of the memoir. And maybe there's some substance. I don't know. But that's how he remembered as a child. But remember, at that time, he would have been 15. He was begging in the streets. In fact, he was picked up from the streets of Kharpert, literally Ulu, the main mosque that is still there today. I think we've been there before. He was begging there. He describes how they were begging there. And it's the two Turkish gentlemen who approached him and they wanted to adopt. He was very, very lucky.
Yes.
Because there were thousands of Armenian orphans who tried to get refuge from deportation caravans in 1917-18 who starved to death. Right? So he could have been one of those too. He was lucky. So luck plays a great role in his life. That in this case, he was picked up as a boy by a Turkish family.
Now, some of the participants we traveled to Turkey with. I see a couple of friends who we went to Turkey with on our trip to, which included Palu in Turkey in 2019. And we were going to we're trying to go to churches and buildings and places that were in ruins and trying to sort of bear witness to the state of these buildings. I noticed in Khralian's account, he mentions this monastery that's close to Til, and it's on your map, Sorp Khach Monastery. Do we know anything about whether there's any remnants of that monastery?
Okay, I may give you a slightly longer answer than that. I haven't been there, and I haven't been to Til. In fact, I made a point of not even putting down the modern name of Til, because now we have this knowledge. The question is, what do we do with it? If we are overtly political, we can be accusatory and go there and say certain things. I do take ethics into account. I do think we should approach the people, for example, living there or looking for that monastery, because to find the monastery, you have to go to the village in a more careful manner. I do want to go to Til. I want to go in a way that's not seen to be hostile and to come to terms with what we think is a common memory. We don't want to put those people on defensive. I suspect many locals, they know a great deal more than we suspect. They may volunteer that information. It's very likely that there are remnants of those Armenians who stayed behind, but one has to be very careful how one approaches these subjects. So yes, I don't know. I don't think much of the monastery remains, but it'd be interesting to find the actual location. The local would certainly know that, and I hope to do that sometime soon. But I want to do it in a sensitive manner, because we want something, if I may put it, I guess, very good to come out of this under the circumstances. See if we can mourn together, as it were, for the people of Til and what happened there.
Well, thank you for that. And I know we have some questions from our audience. I mean, before we open it up, I just want to say that I would thoroughly recommend this book from an educational point of view for lots of reasons. A personal point of view, if you're an Armenian wanting to just know a little bit more about what happened, this book is very personal. And I've read a number of memoirs. They all have their distinct, characteristics, obviously. This one stays with you. And his end message, which is we must tell these stories so that we don't forget. I mean, once you read that, it is hard to forget that, because he wrote it in 1938. And here we are all these years later, still worried, concerned. That's part of our motivation, and a lot of what we do, that we try to tell these stories or get these stories out so that we don't forget. So with that, I'll hand it back.
I said quickly, 1938, the war crowds of Europe, the forgotten genocide, it all comes together. I mean, Khralian's echo, he's talking in that context. It's a sad reality that the world did repeat what happened in 1915. Let me say, Mr. Thierry Garapedian, the grandchild, is actually with us today. So I salute you, Mr. Garapedian, and thank you for allowing us to publish your grandfather's memoir. And if you'd like to say anything, of course, we would like to hear from you. Okay, Carla.
Yeah, and I see he's may have typed a question in Q&A, and he says, "I'm honored to be among you in order to perpetuate the memory of our ancestors." Thank you very much. Mr. Garapedian, is there anything you'd like to tell us about the other grandchildren and the extent to which you know about the story? You can ask that, and also open it up to other people to ask questions.
Is on mute.
There he is. Hello. If you want to unmute yourself, Mr. Garapedian, maybe we can get. Oh, hello.
Hello.
How are you?
Thank you very much. My thoughts are with my grandfather Missak and all the missing from that horrific time. Thank you again for contributing to this work of memory. My grandfather, I'm sorry, but my English is very bad. Thank you for all.
Thank you for joining us today, and we're very grateful. And I hope this account can be available in France as well. That's for you, Ara. But
it is.
Yeah, it is.
It is available.
Excellent. Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you. Merci bien.
Merci.
So, Sedda, Ani, are we opening it up to other questions?
Most definitely. If anyone has any questions from our live audience, please feel free to drop those questions in the Q&A at this time, and we go ahead and choose those questions and have those be answered for you.
I noticed, Ara, that Khralian mentions, he just touches on in almost an offhand way that Lake Goljuk, which was the lake around Harper, was a major killing field. And just to have that very brief reference was a kind of corroboration. Of course, we know that from other accounts, and we know that it was, but the fact that he knew that where he was and the way that he regarded Lake Goljuk, I thought that was interesting.
Yes, and he doesn't, the book is full of these snippets I mentioned earlier. He says things, he doesn't realize how important it is. This is a raw authenticity of it all. It's not like written like a novel that's smoothed out and, you know, the dots and I's are crossed and all the dates are there. There are very few dates in the text. I had to really work out, you know, for mention of a season. In fact, I use the fact that Mrs. Riggs was alive to determine he was there before 1917, because Mrs. Riggs died in April 1917, the Americans left. Right. So this is, for example, how I figured out he was in Harper at that time, because he didn't write this as like a novel. You polish it up, it looks really lovely. You know, it's wholesome, and this is the value of the work. It's not polished up, and this is why it's important as a source. You know, and I keep coming back to that.
And do we learn anything more about how Kurds and Turks related to one another in this account in his particular village and region?
Yes, there's competition amongst them for the Armenian loot sometimes. There were isolated acts of kindness. When he talks of the earlier period, you know, there's rivalry amongst Kurds, Kurdish beys. There are cases where they fight against each other, and so the Armenians are sort of stuck in the middle. It's a very classic presentation. In many ways, the Kurds are what we would call rather backwards. They're illiterate, but they're powerful. These beygs have absolute power over their men, and they can use them any way they want, like tyrants. And this is so, and they can be easily led against Armenians. And I mean, those are the dynamics that come out. Even in Hashim Beg's case, Hashim Beg was doing very well with Armenians. I mean, he probably didn't want to get rid of Armenians because he was making money out of them. He taxed them. He took over the lands, and then when Armenians tilled the land, they had to pay him taxes. So I think it's a state that decided to get rid of Armenians. And then once you decide to slaughter the sheep, all right, you're not going to get the milk anymore. You just make sure that you get as much of the meat as possible. And that seems to be a very practical attitude. And it's a very violent society. I mean, they're beating each other up, including other Kurds. It's a very, very violent society. They beat each other to near death. I mean, he was kicked in his head while he was ill and couldn't move on the floor. So it's a very violent society. It's tribal, divided, and the Armenians are a target because they are wealthier, and that actually is a weakness in this context. Armenian wealth is used against them in order to entice people to participate in the atrocities that did take place, including sexual depravity, I may say, where you simply take girls, and I dare say probably boys as well. We just don't talk about that, you know, abduction, abuse of young boys. I'm sure that happened too. Talk of taboos, you know, but that's what happens when you take protection away from a group of people, and then you tell the others you can do whatever you want to them. It's not the cream of the crop that's going to come and protect them. It's the violence of the vile who will take advantage, and no one's going to stop them.
Yeah, that's very clear in the account. I've just been told that if you can ask a question by raising your hand as well, the raise hand option on Zoom. We have a message from Ohanes Targanian. Hi, Ohanes. Dear Carla and Ara, thank you for your contributions to our community. Hope that many other Armenian families will open to share their stories and will come to a book format as well. Is there an application or a program to join this project? By that, I'm guessing, Ohanas, if we know of people who have stories, how do they get them out? Ara, I mean, you always seem to be open to people coming to you with unpublished memoirs.
People approach us with material. We don't have endowed funds, but what we do is we make the case on a project by project basis, as we did in this case. We try and raise the funds. We try and cover expenses from book sales. So it is important. Sales are important. And we've been doing this since 1992, you know, and we have we got 120 publications. And like I said, our works are being cited because they're in English, but but I would add one more thing: it's don't overlook the Armenian. Armenian is a scholarly language. Armenian books do matter. And if somebody wants to work in this field, they should learn a language to have access to the full scope of what's out there. We should internalize this sort of Anglo-Saxon arrogance of saying, unless it's in English, somehow it's okay to ignore it. It's not okay to ignore it. If this book wasn't published in English, it would have been ignored. But there are other such publications that aren't translated. It's good to translate them. It's good to translate them for political reasons, against deniers. It's good to translate them because there are over 1 million American English-speaking Armenians who don't know Armenian. But I'll tell you more, but the Armenians matter. Even in this book, reading the work in Armenian is much more shocking and much more powerful. And, I would put Armenian first and then in English next. But the English is politically more important, and it bridges between the English-speaking community and Armenian. So yes, we are open. We'd even publish in Armenian if need be. Why not? It's important that we do this for posterity. Yeah.
And just to add on that point, the Gulbenkian Foundation has a major initiative to publish books in Armenian, to republish books in Armenian. So, I think some of this is about republishing. So things that have been published in another language or a long time ago and have been forgotten about, discovering them and bringing them back. So once you open the door to doing that, it's almost endless what you can find. And so it's really about making our community or members of our community be sort of ambassadors, looking out, being aware, and bringing these manuscripts to publishers like the Gomidas Institute. So because it's out there.
And hold scholars accountable for them. I would hold them accountable, anyone working on the genocide, accountable for the Armenian language material that's out there. Just like if you're working on French history or Chinese history, you would have to use French and Chinese sources. And in this case, because they're the only alternative sources available, when Turkish archives are closed or sanitized, these books are giving us information that would otherwise remain unavailable. So we should hold scholars accountable for the use of these sources in their work as well. We should also look in the bibliography. Do they use Armenian sources? Do you see the citations? Let that be one of the critical standards of our own evaluation of many of these works that are coming out.
Vahe Khanbabian has raised his hand. Vahe, could you tap your question in the question and answer box? And I'll read it out for you. And while you do that, he can unmute himself as well. Okay, there you are. Okay, yeah, actually you can unmute yourself, Vahe, and ask the question. There you are. Go ahead.
Since so many books and publications in this matter has been written in English and other languages, I'm wondering if it is wise to send a copy to Mr. Erdogan, Çavuşoğlu, and other big shots over there in dear Turkey to remind them that what they are looking is and reading probably is the correct account of what their Ottoman Empire has done to Armenians, so that they realize that these are not fake 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 writers cannot be fake compared to their fake government and their fake mentality of Turkish mentality. They should be made aware. Instead of our Armenians reading these books and crying all the time about our past history and from our agony. It's enough. They should realize what they have done, and 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 Armenian and non-Armenian also writers, spectators, and witnesses cannot be wrong. They are wrong. Their mentality is wrong. Their Turkish Kurdish savagery is wrong. they should realize this in name of even Islam, not Christianity. Forget about our Christianity. In the name of the Islam, they should realize this, that they have done what they have done to this minority, and they should repent if they are human beings. I doubt it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kambabian. Appreciate that. Ara, it's a very good question about the extent to which the Turkish denial and the Turkish government can be moved or influenced by things like this, if that's the issue. What do you think?
Well, he did touch on important issues. Of course, you're not going to convince President Erdogan or Çavuşoğlu. Frankly, they know what the score is. They represent Turkey. They represent Turkey's supposed best interests. But what we can do is we can reach out to Turkish society. Right? I wouldn't call them barbarians or whatever the word you use. In southeastern Turkey, most people recognize the Armenian genocide, partly because we talk to each other. Many Turks recognize the Armenian genocide. So these books are important, especially in Turkish translation, in order to reach those constituents. I mean, ultimately, we want Turkish society to recognize what happened to Armenians, and in the Turkish state, we no longer continue denying it if it's electorally unacceptable. Probably about 10-15% of people in Turkey do recognize the Armenian genocide today. And I'm talking from experience, almost the entire southeast of Turkey. We need to have a way of dialogue, critical dialogue based on truth, yes, which is what we do, which is what I alluded to earlier. We publish this work, we go to the village, we talk with the locals in a particular language to out the truth, as it were, and then say, well, what do we do as human beings? And as you're quite right, it is against Islam as well. We would even invoke religious ethics, why they should change their position. But that takes time and work, and that is what we are doing. So if we find sponsors, I'd love to see this book with a Missak Khralian agreement, to see it in Turkish, to present this book in the go-to village. I'd like to take the Khralian descendants to the village itself, if it works out. Be interesting, but you'll be surprised the turnaround inside Turkey. I'm not naive. Many people deny, many people choose to believe their government, but a large number of people have doubts, and many people actually know the truth for what it is, and they do talk about it. It's for us to engage that those different circles and make the progressives a larger circle of people. And over time, I think we will have our way in a peaceful manner. So I'm actually optimistic, and these books matter. But they also matter for American Armenians who don't speak Armenian, who need to be informed, critically informed about the genocide, and not simply, well, we hate Turks because of what they did. Well, find out what exactly they did, and let's speak from a critical perspective. Let's be better read. And when we go to Turkey, we argue or present the issues from an informed position, and not simply saying, we have a vendetta against you.
We have a question from Alan Whitehorn, Professor Whitehorn. Given the importance of survivor and witness memoirs, has anyone tried to plot on a map areas where the multitude of memoirs document? That's a very good question. Very good question.
Yes. In fact, I sort of did this part of my presentation, right? I've got 5 sources where they were active. But yes, that will be a good graphic way of assessing what we have there, where they cross each other. You'll be surprised how much, especially if you put documents in. Now, you talk memoirs published, but we could actually put affidavits from survivors. And so there will be thousands of spots on that map, and that would help, I guess, make scholarship easier. Yeah. But I'm very careful. I'm more old school. I actually believe in doing the work than keep indexing things and let somebody else do the analysis. I think we have enough material to work with from an analytical perspective to deal with the core issues of what we're dealing with. But yes, it's a good idea.
And we have a question from Aslan Aslanian. We always talk about dialogue with Turks. What about Arabs? They also witnessed the genocide and all those events. So are we also talking to Arabs and obtaining information, specifically Arabs in Syria, Aleppo? Good question.
Yes, there have been such people. We don't do that. I mean, Gomidas Institute is a self-funding organization. If there was a grant available, it's possible to do. Would that be my priority? Could be. There are some people who have worked on in their Zor area. They have collected information. And I suspect there's a lot more than I'm aware of because it's not my area of specialization. But I can certainly say for Turkey itself, you know, there's this scope for 10 times over the work in a critical way and in a useful way that one can do. In fact, there are Kurds today who go around collecting this material and publishing it because it's part of their history, and they want to align themselves, in this case, with the victims and not the victimizer. And that is a way, that's showing contrition, that's a way of resolving the issue based on truth and the beginning of dialogue. And that was happening until 2015. Things stopped because of Turkey's internal politics, but it's worth continuing again. And that's what I'm personally committed to and plan to do in the years ahead that I have on this earth.
And I'd add that the account by Levon, Crows of the Desert, what's Levon's last name? My apologies, I'm looking at my book. Levon, somebody else will type it in. His book is specifically about the Armenians who went into the desert, were helped by Arabs to save Armenians, the expeditionary force. Very fascinating account that was made into the documentary Crows of the Desert. That's a good one. And we have Arab eyewitnesses in the Armenian Film Foundation collection. So very important, you know, witnesses of, you know, how they encountered Armenians, what their experiences were. So that's important. And I would add that in addition to the Arab component, there's the Assyrian component, which is also an area which we need to expand on. And there are Assyrians who have collected Assyrian testimonies about the genocide. And so those have been done, but it's a matter of, you know, getting those out, getting those documented, you know, getting them into an archive and sharing them. So, you know, you would think over 100 years that we've done a lot. We still have a lot to do. It's not really that long in the big scheme of things. And so the Arab component, the Assyrian component, and even more Armenian survivor stories that have maybe been published but have been forgotten about, as we were talking about, that's still a lot on our agenda to accomplish. And I think that we've gotten to the end of our questions. So I just would like to thank Ara. Thank you, Ara, for publishing the book. And thank you to the Caribbeans for allowing the book to be published. And thank you to the Ararat-Eskijian Museum, to Maggie Bangasaria Goshen for her motivation to get this book published, which happened, as Ara said, a conversation in Palu that we just happened to be there, and it kind of came out of nowhere. So it was just being in the location that kind of created the impetus to move this project forward, and here we are. So thank you for all of you participated, and we look forward to meeting again in the near future. Thank you.
Thank you.